technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. Today is Election Day. Have you voted? You should, but wait till the end of the show, because in our second hour, we'll talk about the election with a longtime friend of Point of View, John Fund. In this hour, we're going to be looking at a lot of things you've been taught about American history and economics that just aren't true. My guest for this hour is former Texas Senator Phil Gramm. He served in the House for 6 years and in the Senate for 18 years. He was responsible for several major pieces of legislation: the Gramm-Latta budget, the Gramm-Rudman Act. He was chairman of the Banking Committee, the Senate Banking Committee, for a while, and helped modernize banking, and was responsible for the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. He also taught at Texas A&M University economics for about 12 years. Since he left the Senate, he was vice chairman of UBS Investment Bank, and for the last 13 years, he's been vice chairman of Lone Star Funds, and he's married to Dr. Wendy Lee Gramm, who was also an economist, taught at Texas A&M, and former chairman of the U.S. Commodities Futures Trading Commission under President Reagan. Senator Gramm, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Merrill.
Well, we're going to be talking about Senator Gramm's new book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. Now, this is, in a sense, kind of a sequel to a book he came out with about 3 years ago, The Myth of American Inequality. And you know, Senator, I had John early on, I think probably a year and a half ago, talking about that excellent book. And now we're going to talk about your new book that you did with Dr. Donald Boudreaux, who is at George Mason University, an economist there. But you're going to try to address a number of things we've been told in American history about economics, what happened during the Industrial Revolution, some of the other economic events that we've seen. And you have in your book 7 myths that you want to point out. The first one is the Industrial Revolution, and I know you had a piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday with Mike Solon where you're talking about AI, but you're highlighting some of the things that happened in the Industrial Revolution and just the progress that started. So tell me, why did you write this book?
Well, Merrill, first of all, I've always been interested in why people hold the views they hold. It's so tempting to say, well, Bernie Sanders holds the views he holds because he's a socialist, and Phil Gramm holds the views he holds because he's a conservative. Well, that doesn't provide much information. Why does Bernie Sanders hold the views he holds? Why do I hold the views I hold? And in having been engaged in public policy debate, both in the private sector and as part of government for a quarter of a century, I basically found that when people have different views, normally if you ask them questions about how the world works and their views of what happened in various historical periods, or their view of the two contemporary issues that dominate public debate, poverty and inequality, you find that while Thomas Jefferson said, good men with the same facts are prone to disagree, while they have the same facts, you'll generally find that they have a very different perception of how the world works and what the history of the country is. Part of that is sort of your life's experience. I don't know what Bernie Sanders' life experience is. I know he grew up in a middle-class family in Brooklyn. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. My brother was the first person in my extended family that ever graduated from high school, much less went to college and graduated from college. Throughout my whole life, I have watched how opportunity is virtually everywhere, how people who work hard succeed, and never in my life has anybody ever said to me that there was anything I couldn't be or could be based on who my daddy was. And so if somebody's going to convince me that the world is unfair or that the system is rigged, they would have to get up mighty early in the morning. And of course, all the evidence I've seen since convinces me that my life experience is basically a microcosm of the country. And then if you ask people what happened in the Industrial Revolution, basically you're going to find that people who believe in more government involvement in our lives and in the economy almost invariably believe that during the Industrial Revolution, that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. But that is totally at variance with the facts. And so that's sort of where the book begins. Why do we hold the views we hold? And how can you change somebody's views? By changing the fact base that they have. And so we set out in the book 7 myths, and we first give the undisputed facts, and then what we call the myth. And in almost every case, Merrill, the myth is conventional wisdom. We generally cite the best-selling high school textbook and the best-selling college textbook as part of the myth. And we try not to set up a straw man, but give it a full airing with its strongest arguments and the facts that it presents. And then we set out to debunk the myth. And that's basically how the book works.
Well, you know, I've read Karl Marx's Capital and Charles Dickens, and if I go by them, I find workers they're overworked, they're underpaid, subsistence wages, they're packed in houses. But you point out a number of facts just in terms of income, prosperity, and other things that happened during the Industrial Revolution.
Well, first of all, let's just talk about the facts, and then go back and talk about the myth. The Industrial Revolution in America primarily occurred between 1870 and 1900 because it was somewhat delayed by the Civil War. In those 30 years, America had economic growth of biblical proportions. GDP tripled, per capita income doubled, wages in manufacturing rose by 173%. The cost of life staples, food, housing, clothing.
Senator, hold that thought. We'll be back with you after a break. Stay with us. We'll be right after. We'll be back with you in a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Alan West argues in a recent commentary that we have come to a time when we should have a serious discussion about the roles, duties, responsibilities, and accountability of judges in our constitutional republic. He explains that judges are appointed or elected to a position where they're to correctly judge the law. He also reminds us that we read about judges in the Old Testament. Samson was a judge, but was also a warrior. Deborah was not only a judge, but a prophet, and her prophetic vision enabled her to aid in a military victory. Article 3 created just one court of judges, and that was the Supreme Court. All the other courts, district and appellate courts, were created by Congress and thus subject to the checks and balances established by the framers. Allen West then points to the fact that judges shall hold their offices during good behavior. Yet he argues we see a lot of examples of bad behavior by many judges. He wonders where these judges were when the previous administration openly allowed immigrants into the republic. He adds that when the Supreme Court ruled that President Biden did not have the enumerated power to forgive student loan debt, he did it anyway. Perhaps he argues it is time for scholars like George Washington law professor Jonathan Turley and Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz to accurately define what good behavior means for the judiciary. There must be a standard and there must be accountability. The framers gave federal judges a lifetime appointment to keep them above the politics of the day, but also added the provision of good behavior to prevent them from becoming black-robed tyrants. It is time for some accountability. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/antisemitism. Viewpoints.info/antisemitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson. My guest for this hour, Senator Phil Gramm. We're talking about his new book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom, Debunking the 7 Great Myths of American Capitalism. And Senator, you were talking about some of the progress that we made during the industrial period here in the U.S.
Yeah. So to sum up what I said before, we had growth of biblical proportions in the 30 years of the Industrial Revolution, from 1870 to 1900. GDP tripled, population doubled, per capita income doubled, wages rose by 173%. The real cost of life staples, housing, clothing, food, fell in half. Lifespan increased by a quarter. Literacy exploded. By every measure of well-being, that 30-year period in the Industrial Revolution in America was a period where ordinary working people saw their well-being rise faster than had ever occurred in the history of the world. No people who had ever walked the face of the earth had seen their well-being grow faster. And yet, everywhere we read about the suffering, especially of workers during the Industrial Revolution. So how did this happen? Well, it happened because, and the same thing happened in Britain, by the way. It just took 60 years in Britain instead of 30, but exactly the same result. So how did it happen that people got so confused and are still confused today about what happened? Well, the Industrial Revolution was a wave of creative destruction. It massively increased production and welfare, but it destroyed the old economic and social order. And nobody saw this, Merrill, better than Karl Marx. Karl Marx explains how the capitalism had created more productive power than all previous generations combined, and it had done it in less than 100 years. But it had changed everything. It had destroyed the old system where people worked for the owner of the manor house. It had destroyed the medieval system. It had destroyed the cottage industry. And so there was a wave of creation, but there was also a wave of destruction. And as a result of the creation and the destruction, people moved from the rural areas into the cities. And you've got to realize that the literary class, the people who wrote, who controlled Parliament, and who funded people who wrote, were the landed gentry who were the big losers of the Industrial Revolution, relatively speaking. Mm-hmm. And so you have, for example, Arnold Toynbee, one of the great historians of the 19th century, writes that the Industrial Revolution was one of the darkest periods through which a nation has ever passed. And Henry George, the economic journalist, whose picture, by the way, is in the National Portrait Gallery in the same room as the industrial giants of America, and by his picture, it has this little plaque that gives his pronouncement on the Industrial Revolution. The rich got richer, the poor grew helpless, and the middle class was blown away. Well, total fiction. And you mentioned the Christmas Carol. Mm-hmm. Charles Dickens. Came out in 1849 in January. And all Charles Dickens knew was what he had seen in the past. And the past was basically a world that had had no economic growth in 1,500 years, mm-hmm. where people lived pretty much like their grandparents had lived. And so his fault with Ebenezer Scrooge is that Scrooge is a Scrooge. He's a wealth hoarder, but he's totally honest, as the book makes clear. He invests every penny he earns. His partner left him his fortune, which he continued to invest. But the problem is that Charles Dickens can see only one way that poor people can be made better off, and that's charity. What he didn't see was that in 1849, the per capita income of the world, which had been flat for 1,500 years, had turned up. And our economic system of private property, individual rights, where workers own their own labor and their own capital, produce more prosperity than any benevolent king or loving bishop or protectionist for implementing mercantile policy or any guild could have ever produced.
Now, you mentioned the industrialist, and that takes us to your second myth, which is that period from 1870 to 1900, you had major corporations, you had monopolies coming up, and that got a call for major regulation that people like the Matthew Josephson says these are robber barons who are taking advantage of people. What happened during that period in your second myth?
Well, first of all, what really happened is that progressives were so focused on the fact that by 1892, there were 4,030 millionaires in the country. 4,030. that they turned a complete blind eye to 66 million Americans who were better off than any people who'd ever lived on the face of the earth because of the Industrial Revolution. What happened during the Industrial Revolution is the railroads created a nationwide market. And so you started for the first time in American history to have nationwide businesses, the stockyards in Chicago, Standard Oil. And so what we show in the book is that the government got into regulating the Chicago stockyards for two reasons. One, state governments were very unhappy that meat was being sold that was of higher quality and lower price, being distributed nationwide out of Chicago with refrigerated railroad cars, than the meat that was available in local markets. And so the local economy was being hurt. And then you had the famous book written, The Jungle,
Upton Sinclair,
portrayed the stockyards as you got all these rats and you got people fall into the hamburger vat and they just grind them up with it. Well, what the USDA, once that the regulation of the stockyards was imposed, the people who actually got their jobs in government because of the myth went to Chicago, did a comprehensive study of both production and the final product, and concluded that it was a total falsehood. In fact, over 1 million people a year were going through the stockyards. So the idea that they would let conditions there deteriorate and create problems with the quality of food, which would have put them out of business, was preposterous to begin with. And we show in the book that production grew faster and prices declined faster.
Hold that thought, Senator. When we come back, we're going to look at FDR. Did FDR save capitalism? Was the Great Depression a failure of capitalism? Stay with us. We'll be back with former Senator Phil Gramm.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And we're back with our guest, former Texas Senator Phil Gramm. We're talking about his new book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. We should have a link to that book on our website, pointofview.net. I'd encourage you to go there and get it because it is filled with information. Senator, when we were talking, I wanted to get to your third myth because there you highlight...
Well, let me finish up, Merrill. Let me finish the second one. So basically what we show is that the growth in output and the decline in prices was greater before the Sherman Act than it was after the Sherman Act. And that, in fact, the progressive era regulation protected producers from competition, not consumers. And in fact, Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy in the 1970s and up to 1980, repealed those regulations and set off the growth we've had in transportation. Air travel costs are half today what they were then. The cost of moving things, logistics like inventory, the things we buy in grocery stores, fallen in half. And then all the information revolution came about because the Carter deregulation. So the progressive era regulatory period was harmful to the economy and the consumer. And President Carter's leadership, then followed by Reagan, opening the economy up again, produced the modern world.
Now, in the third myth, you are looking at FDR and the Great Depression, and the notion is that capitalism was the Great Depression was a failure of capitalism, and then many people believe that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, stepped in with all his regulations and manipulations of the economy and ultimately saved capitalism. What do you think about that?
Well, my mother and grandmother went to their graves believing that FDR got America out of the Depression. But what really happened, if you look at the facts, is that America was an agricultural economy. And so we had two periods where there was a lot of demand for credit and for money. In the fall when the crops were harvested and in the spring when they were planted. And so periodically, the banking system got out of kilter and people became concerned about whether their money was actually in the bank. And we would have runs on banks. It happened in 1907. And what happened is that ultimately J.P. Morgan and the government and the big banks in New York injected money into the system and stopped the panic of 1907 from becoming a depression. But it so alarmed Congress that they passed the Federal Reserve Act with the goal of preventing that from ever happening again by being there to provide liquidity when the banking system needed it. But in 1930 through 1933, the Federal Reserve Bank stood idly by and watched 1/3 of all the banks in the country go broke. And a stock market crash turned into a Great Depression. Now, the argument was made after the Depression was underway that it was caused by underconsumption, that income had become, in the booming 20s, distributed where the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. And as a result, there was underconsumption and that was the cause of the Depression. The problem is when you go back and look at the numbers, the percentage of income going to workers actually rose in the 1920s. It didn't fall. And this idea that the stock market collapse was caused by speculation with people buying on the margin requirements for buying stocks were higher when the market collapsed than they had ever been in American history. So the facts don't fit what is being claimed. And of course, the claim for underconsumption was if there's underconsumption because people don't have enough income, you redistribute income, which is what the administration wanted to do. And then you got all these policies, first with Herbert Hoover, who, contrary to the myth, was not someone who sat by and fiddled while Rome burned. He started the New Deal with massive spending, government intervention. And then Roosevelt picked that up, and the hostility between the government and business caused investment to collapse and kept us in the Depression longer than any other country in the world except France, which dealt with it basically the same way we did. Most other developed countries, when you look at League of Nations data, got out of the Depression twice as fast as we did. And this idea that the Depression ended when the war came, the war certainly put people to work by drafting people into the army. But we didn't regain the level of prosperity we had had in 1929 until Eisenhower was president. The stock market didn't get back to its pre-29 value until 1952. And Truman didn't scare business as much as Roosevelt, and Eisenhower was a pillar of stability and, of course, conservative values. So that's what happened during the Great Depression. It was a failure of government policy, not capitalism.
During the war, manufacturing picked up significantly, a lot of that towards supplying the needs of the war. But there is in the fourth myth that you have here, this notion, and we hear this from President Trump, we've heard it for several years, that we no longer manufacture anything in the country, that we've offshored all our manufacturing, and that's one of the great problems that we have. How is that a myth? Well,
it's a myth because it's verifiably false. We produce 2.5 times as much manufactured products in value terms as we did in 1975, the last time we had a trade surplus. And we produce it not with 30% of the labor force, but with 7.8% of the labor force because of technological change and mechanism. And mechanization. And if you look at what happened to agriculture. At the beginning of the 19th century, we had about a third of all American workers on the farm. And at the end of and today we have 1.2%. Now, has agriculture been hollowed out? No, we feed ourselves and much of the world. What has happened is technology has made it possible for us to produce more and more with fewer and fewer people. The same thing is happening in manufacturing, and it's happening everywhere, including in China. And in the first Trump term, we had the president came in the first year, he deregulated and he cut taxes, and the economy boomed, the trade deficit exploded. as people wanted to invest in America and came in and invested in America and drove up the price of the dollar on the world market and made imports cheaper. And then Trump imposed the tariffs, and the percentage of people working in manufacturing continued to decline, and economic growth declined in 2019 prior to the pandemic.
Senator, we'll have to hold it right there, and we'll come back with our last segment with Senator Phil Gramm, talking about his new book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. So stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with former Texas Senator Phil Gramm. And Senator, take a minute just to talk about the notion that deregulation caused the banking crisis, the financial crisis in 2007 to 2009. But don't take too much time, because I want to get to number 6, which is the myth of American inequality, because that is so important to what we're thinking today. So talk to me a little bit about the financial crisis.
Very briefly, the financial crisis was caused by a decision that was made to stimulate home ownership by reducing the standards that had to be met to get a mortgage and to get the mortgage guaranteed by the government housing agencies, Freddie and Fannie. And by the time, and so we had systematically had the government reduce the standards for making loans and government pressuring banks to make more and more subprime loans and loans that didn't have documentation, to the point that when the wheels came off, 50% of the loans that were being made were subprime. And so when the housing bubble broke and people couldn't sell their houses for more than they owed, they left the keys on the floor and walked out the front door. And we had a collapse in mortgage-backed securities. The government had encouraged banks to hold them by making them the equivalent of government bonds. And so we destroyed the financial base of the banking system. There had been in the previous 30 years no deregulation. There had been action to create more competition, but nothing had been deregulated. We let banks and insurance companies and securities companies do more things, but they were regulated under exactly the same laws with exactly the same regulators that they'd been regulated by before. Again, the subprime crisis, as it should be called, occurred because government policy promoted the lending of vast amounts of money to people who either could not or would not pay the money back.
Now, when we get to myth number 6, the myth of American inequality, you wrote a whole book about that about 3 years ago. And but it was very, very interesting what you said in there, because you point out why it looks like we are more unequal in our income than we really are. Explain that.
Well, there are 3 key points. One, the Census Bureau, which measures household income, on which all other statistics in the government, poverty and inequality, are measured, does not count transfer payments that are made in kind, that is, not in cash, as income. So, for example, as astonishing as this sounds, when people get food stamps, a debit card they take to the grocery store and buy groceries, that does not count as their income. When government with rent subsidies pays rent, that doesn't count as income. When Medicaid pays their health care bills, that doesn't count as income, even though 70% of the income of working, moderate income Americans is spent on groceries, rent, and health care. When you count all of those transfer payments and you take into account taxes, which the census does not take into account, they don't count tax credits where people on welfare get a check from the Treasury. They don't count that as income. And when you pay your taxes, they don't count that as income lost. They act as if you still have the income. So when you make those adjustments, count the transfer payments that people get from the government as income, and the taxes they pay to government as income lost, the Census Bureau numbers say the ratio of the top 20% of income recipients, the bottom 20%, is 16.7 to 1. Actually, when you take into account transfer payments and taxes, it's about 4 to 1. Now, you can say 4 to 1 is too big. It's a very different debate. And also, you hear every day how inequality is getting worse. Well, actually, if you count taxes and transfer payments, there's less inequality today than was in 1947. Just a small amount less, but nevertheless less. And then the second point is that when you read this stuff about rich people not paying their taxes. You remember when ProPublica had the stolen tax data, and for people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, and they were saying how they didn't pay, quote, their fair share. Well, when you actually looked at the data that they had stolen, they reported the income taxes these people had paid, but not their income. They made up an income figure by saying what their income would have been had they sold every asset they owned every year. So what would your income be if you sold your house, sold your car, sold your pension, and cashed out of all your insurance and paid taxes on it? Well, no country in the world taxes that way. But it was a classic bait and switch. Another thing they do is they talk about 0.1% of earners and how much they make as if somehow that is relevant. Example, Elon Musk is really rich. But I'm richer because of Elon Musk. I live out in the country, and I had a bunch of damn wires in my attic, and I was paying 10 times as much as the satellite he put out that I bought and put on my house. And it's 3 times as good. So Elon Musk is really rich, but I'm richer.
Senator,
how did Bill Gates make me poor by creating 200,000 jobs?
Senator, we're just about out of time. Have you got another book coming out?
I don't know, but I'm thinking about writing The Making of the Reagan Revolution.
Oh, good.
There's a lot about that great man that is not known. And given I was there when it happened, I've thought hard about doing it. But I want to urge people, get a copy of the new book, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. Read it. You'll see that this is a better country than you think. And it will give you the facts you need when people raise all these issues as to why they want government to tell you what to do.
Senator, we've got to leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a link to that to the book on our Point of View website, pointofview.net, so I'd encourage you to go and take a look. Senator, thanks so much for all your service. And when we come back, we'll be going to John Fund to talk about the election. You don't want to miss it. Stay with us here on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
My husband and I are your supporters. We just really appreciate the show and the people you bring on.
I just want to commend you guys on your program. I love listening to you. It's a blessing. Been listening to you for several years. Your program has helped my family see current events and elections and politics through the eyes and the principles of Scripture. And that's been enlightening, and we're trying to pass that on to others.
I want to say, first of all, that I really enjoyed the Millennial Roundtable, and I love the program altogether. I think Kirby is great, and I really appreciate all of y'all, all that y'all do, and the truth that y'all put out.
Hey, great show. Love all your comments and what you're talking about.
Thanks again for what you do.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View can...
This is Point of View. And now, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and today is Election Day. If you haven't voted yet, you should, but wait till after the show, because we're going to be talking about the elections, and we may be able to provide you with some important information. My guest for this hour, John Fund. He is National Affairs columnist for National Review. He worked for the Wall Street Journal for more than 2 decades and was on the editorial board, the newspaper's editorial board, for several years. He's our go-to person when we're talking about election fraud. In 2004, he wrote Stealing Elections: How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, and then 2 books with Hans von Spakovsky, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk, and he also wrote Obama's Enforcer, Eric Holder's Justice Department. John, thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure, Merrill.
Okay, it is a big election day. We've heard nothing but about election stuff here for the past several weeks. You're in the New York area, but before we do that, let's talk about the 2 governor elections, New Jersey, Virginia. How do you see those things going?
Well, New Jersey is a blue state. For example, it hasn't elected a Republican to the U.S. Senate in 50 years. But the last election, the Democratic governor only won re-election by 3 points. Very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
The same Republican who barely lost in 2021 is running again, Jack Ciattarelli. And he's not running against the incumbent governor, he's leaving because of term limits. He's running against Mickey Sherrill, who's a Democratic congresswoman from the New Jersey suburbs. The Democrats have nominated a former Naval Academy graduate, a relative moderate in the Democratic Party, someone who has a nice, toothy smile, very charming, and they hope that that new image will carry them back into the governor's mansion. Ciattarelli is pounding away on the fact that the cost of living in New Jersey is out of control.
Mm-hmm.
It's the 4th most taxed state in the country. The electricity rates, because of all of the solar and wind power investments, have gone up dramatically. Property taxes continue to grow up. It's almost I think it's the 2nd most property tax state in the country. So he is pounding away that there has to be a change. Otherwise, the kind of exodus we're seeing from New York City down to Florida and other states is already moved over to New Jersey. More and more people are moving out of the state. And he says the only way to stop that is try something different.
And what about Virginia?
Virginia, Glenn Youngkin won an incredible victory in 2021. He took a state that had moved to the Democrats into the Republican column. He's governed well. His popularity rating is still high. But his lieutenant governor, who he's supporting to succeed him because he can only serve 1 term, Winsome Sears, has a great resume. But she's been a tentative candidate. She has made some mistakes. She's hired not necessarily the best staff. And she's running against the Virginia version of Mickey Sherrill, a moderate Democratic member of Congress who smiles a lot and doesn't appear threatening or very liberal. So the polls show the race in New Jersey to be within the margin of error. But in Virginia, Winsome Sears has not been able to close the gap, and I would have to call her an underdog right now.
There was an issue arose, though, in Virginia, didn't it, about another state legislator, I think it was?
Well, a former state legislator named Joe Johns is in real trouble. When he was in the legislature, he basically sent a series of texts and messages to a colleague basically saying he wanted certain Republicans to die. They deserve to be killed. And he's running for Attorney General. And I think it has thrown a wrench into his campaign. And I think the Republican Attorney General, David Mayares, is probably going to win. And because, again, every Virginia governor can only serve one term, he is likely to be the Republican candidate to run again in 2029. And I think so that will be at least one win for the Republicans in Virginia.
Now, going to Maine, they have a Senate race there, and that got shaken up with Nazi symbols.
Well, the Senate race is next year.
Oh, okay. That's right.
It's in the even year election. But what's happened is there's a failed oyster farmer who's running as a populist, Bernie Sanders supporter, and it turns out the fellow, when he was in the Marines, had a very colorful past, which including getting tattoos, among which was a Nazi SS symbol. And he claims he didn't know that at the time, that it happened during some drunken, revel. And but he's clearly got problems. So I think the Democrats may be looking at a different candidate for the election next year. In this year's election, though, there are two very interesting races. There's one on gun control, whether or not people who have had previous encounters regarding domestic altercations can petition to get their weapons back. And there's also a very important one on voter ID and absentee voting. Maine has gone to mail-in voting in a big way, and it turns out that there's real problems with that. The ballot security isn't sufficient, and that was demonstrated when a woman in a small Maine town the other day got an Amazon package, and inside the Amazon package were 250 blank absentee ballots. So the question is, where were they from? Where were they destined for? And where was the intention that someone fill them out and mail them in? And, of course, voter ID is also part of that initiative. It's very popular in Maine, as it is everywhere, but the left is opposing it, saying that it would be a destruction of democracy to actually ask people to prove who they say they are, and that's going to be a very close race to watch.
Now, we've got to talk about the New York mayor's race because that's been getting so much attention. I have to tell you, I watched Zoran Mamdani with Jon Stewart last week.
By the way, it's Zoran Mamdani, and everyone gets it wrong.
Mamdani.
It's a Ma. Think of mother and then Donnie.
Okay.
It's a Ma and a Donnie.
He was on Jon Stewart, and Jon Stewart did his interview for about 15, 18 minutes or so. And as
it wasn't an interview; it was a suck-up.
Yes, it was, but it was. I'm looking at Zoran, and he is, he comes across as likable, having a good time, authentic in a way. I mean, when you're going against Andrew Cuomo, I can look at this and I can say I don't agree with anything Zoran believes. On the other hand, I looked at this and thought, if I'm just an average person listening to this, he looks like a very likable guy.
Well, look. I just interviewed Azra Nomani, who's an Indian Muslim American journalist, and she has written a series of searing exposés on how the Democratic Socialists of America and CARE, which is a group of Islamic extremists, have basically been grooming people all over the country to run for office on a progressive Democratic Socialist banner. And this involves mainstreaming extreme politicians.
John, hold that thought for a second. We'll be back on Point of View in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Alan West argues in a recent commentary that we have come to a time when we should have a serious discussion about the roles, duties, responsibilities, and accountability of judges in our constitutional republic. He explains that judges are appointed or elected to a position where they're to correctly judge the law. He also reminds us that we read about judges in the Old Testament. Samson was a judge, but was also a warrior. Deborah was not only a judge, but a prophet, and her prophetic vision enabled her to aid in a military victory. Article 3 created just one court of judges, and that was the Supreme Court. All the other courts, district and appellate courts, were created by Congress and thus subject to the checks and balances established by the framers. Allen West then points to the fact that judges shall hold their offices during good behavior. Yet he argues we see a lot of examples of bad behavior by many judges. He wonders where these judges were when the previous administration openly allowed immigrants into the republic. He adds that when the Supreme Court ruled that President Biden did not have the enumerated power to forgive student loan debt, he did it anyway. Perhaps he argues it is time for scholars like George Washington law professor Jonathan Turley and Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz to accurately define what good behavior means for the judiciary. There must be a standard and there must be accountability. The framers gave federal judges a lifetime appointment to keep them above the politics of the day, but also added the provision of good behavior to prevent them from becoming black-robed tyrants. It is time for some accountability. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And thank you for joining me. By phone, we've got John Fund. He is the National Affairs columnist for National Review and an expert on elections, somebody we always go to talk about what's happening in the elections. Now, John, you were talking a bit about what was an expose on Muslims sort of grooming candidates.
Azra Nomani, who is a Muslim journalist, a very brave lady who's written a lot about how the Democratic Socialists of America and Muslim forces are often in alliance. She reports that both AOC and Modani have been groomed for these races that they've run. They hold auditions where they have a bunch of candidates who have not served in public office, therefore they don't have a record to defend, and they present a speech, and people vote on them, and they're then given money. They're given an enormous volunteer workforce, and they're sent out basically to put a moderate face on what are very socialistic extreme policies. And it's worked not only in New York City, but in many other places. I went to a Fairfax County, Virginia school board meeting a few years ago, and there was a very nice lady there who had been elected, but she was so vituperatively anti-Israel, so vituperatively progressive, that she was thrown out in the next election. But she won the first time because she had a nice smile and, sounded very reasonable. This is happening all over the country. In New York City, it's succeeding because, of course, New York is a very, very blue state and city.
Yeah, well, Modani's past association with the Democratic Socialists of America and his radical views, talk a bit about that, because there's been some discussion of there, but occasionally people are coming out with things that he said in the past, and these sound radical, but he seems to sort of distance himself from them now.
Well, he's not stupid. So he will get on television now and say, well, that was in the past and I've matured or I've rethought these things. But this is not the long distant past. This is 2020. This is 2022 when he was campaigning for office. And he has said the most amazing things. And of course, to this day, he refuses to repudiate the term from the river to the sea or the global intifada or other things which clearly calls for the destruction of Israel.
His father, I think it's his father, isn't he, is an academic and recently wrote a book defending Idi Amin, of all people.
Well, the family is from Uganda, and in fact, Madani recently got married in Uganda at the family compound there, which is apparently quite expansive and lush. And obviously, we weren't invited as guests, so we don't know what happened. But we do know that many people attending that were government ministers, and the government in Uganda is virulently anti-gay. They basically call for the persecution and prosecution of anyone who's suspected of homosexuality. So Madani wants to have it both ways. He wants to appear as the tolerant progressive, but he associates himself with all kinds of people in many respects, especially regarding Israel and regarding gays, who are extremely intolerant.
He's gone through a list of the things he wants to do: freeze the rent, I think free subway, free childcare, and other things of that nature. Will he need either the state or the city to sign off on those things in order to be able to do them?
Well, the challenge here is perception versus reality. The reality is that the mayor of New York does not have nearly as much power as most people think. He can't raise any tax on his own or even with the city council's permission, except the property tax. And that would be a fifth rail of politics to touch that one. For the income tax, for the corporate tax, for all the things that he wants to do, he'd have to get permission from the state legislature, which, while it's filled with Democrats, are not necessarily people who are going to go along with what he wants, because they know the damage that those higher taxes would do to the financial industry that New York depends upon. So, in addition, on the rent, he can probably freeze the rent, but he can't really have full control of rent control until several years into his term as mayor, if he wins, because it's a rotating series of appointments, so he doesn't get to appoint the entire board at the beginning. He has to have it in staggered intervals. So I think that the reality is, and of course there's crime. He's already said he's going to try to keep the current police commissioner, who's universally viewed to have done a good, conscientious job in keeping crime down. But the reality is that he can't change or won't change things that dramatically. But the perception will be that he is going to. And that perception can become a form of reality because it can cause people to leave the city, especially wealthy people who have seen so many of their neighbors move to Florida, move to Arizona, move to Texas, or even to New Jersey. If there's a Republican governor elected in New Jersey today and Madani wins in New York, I think the skyline of New Jersey facing New York is going to look a lot taller and a lot more prosperous in a year or so. So the danger is the perception will mean the city is in decline. The bad old days are coming back. The days that Mayor Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg reversed, and that's the problem. So I don't think New York is going to fall apart if Madani wins. I do think people are going to become very nervous and think about leaving, and that will contribute to the city's possible decline.
So there's a fair chance he becomes, in essence, a frustrated mayor because he can't get either the city council or the state legislature or other controlling bodies to be able to acquiesce to what he wants to do.
Well said. And, of course, that will mean, if that happens, that he gets less revenue in, which means he has less money to give out, which makes it less likely he can create more free stuff. I think, by the way, he also wants free universal child care, which is an expensive ticket item.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's all a recipe for, if you're a progressive, they'll be asking themselves in 4 years what went wrong. And if you're a normal New Yorker, they're going to say, everything they said he was going to lead to, all the problems that were said to
But is it fair to say that people like Modani, AOC, are they're the essentially? I would argue the energy behind the Democratic Party. They're sort of the people driving the agenda. Even though I suspect a lot of traditional Democrats, maybe slightly leaning conservative, just simply do not want to do that, but maybe can't stop it.
Well, let's look at it the last 10 years. What's happened in 2016? Everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to sweep to the nomination. Turns out she barely won over Bernie Sanders. And that was the wake-up call, because Bernie Sanders from Vermont was 80 years old. He was a socialist, had been elected as one, even though he ran under the Democratic banner. And he clearly was on the far left of the Democratic Party, but he almost won. Well, under the first term of Donald Trump, the socialists, emboldened by that, organized. They ran candidates. AOC ran in 2018 and won a House seat that was a big upset. And by 2020, they were powerful enough that Bernie Sanders was on the way to winning the nomination.
Mm-hmm.
And it took all of the other Democratic candidates to drop out and endorse Joe Biden to keep the nomination away from Sanders. Well, Sanders agreed to finally drop out, but he took a price. He had a meeting with Biden, and Biden agreed to a lot of policy concessions and basically said the progressives are going to be playing the policy tune in the Biden White House if he wins. And sure enough, that happened. Joe Biden turned out to be, I think it's fair to say, far more liberal, far more spendthrift, far more a cultural warrior for the left than anyone expected. And he basically looked like a guy who was just happy to be in the office and have all the pomp and ceremony around him, while he didn't care what his staff did to drive the country far to the left. And what happened in 2024, they lost with Kamala Harris. Well, they didn't slow down. They have gone back to the local grassroots and organized, and the first fruit of their labors is that they are on the verge, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the pressure group inside the Democratic Party driving all this, they are on the verge of electing a mayor in the largest city in the country.
It's amazing. My guest for this hour, John Fund. He is the National Affairs columnist for National Review. We have information about him on our website at pointofview.net. If you're interested, if you'd like to give a call, you can call us at 1-800-351-1212. That's 1-800-351-1212. If you have a question about elections for John Fund, when we get back, we'll talk a bit about the redistricting that's going on around the country. So stay with us here on Point of View.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or Call to Invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, Dr. Merrill Matthews.
And we're back on Point of View. Thank you for joining us. Today is Elections Day, and I would encourage you to go out and vote if you haven't done that already. We're talking about elections with our sort of resident expert on elections and election fraud, John Fund. He is the National Affairs columnist with National Review. John, we've talked a bit about some of the elections that are going on right now, but also there's this issue of redistricting there. President Trump asked Texas to do some redistricting mid-decade, and Texas was willing to go along with that, and now other states have gotten involved. So is this a good idea?
Well, I think it's a race to the bottom for American democracy. I think that there's a bill in Congress from a representative named Kevin Kiley from California that would ban mid-decade redistricting.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand, some of the complaints about this. It all started in 2020 when the U.S. Census has admitted they made a terrible mistake.
Yes.
They literally imputed certain people living in certain places that didn't exist. Therefore, that changed the number of people recorded as living in certain states. Overrepresented states like Illinois and Rhode Island, and underrepresented states like Texas and Florida.
And that occurred because of the pandemic, right?
I think
okay.
There's debate there. Certainly the pandemic may have had some impact, but remember, the census took place on April 1st, 2020. The pandemic hadn't really gotten up to full steam then. I think it was some miscalculations by census bureaucrats, and I think that some of it, shall we say, may have been people who chose to make those mistakes rather than made them completely inadvertently. Anyway, about 3 or 4 districts shifted from red states to blue states. And I think that infuriated President Trump, and he's been looking to correct that for a long time. And he lit on the fact that in Texas there's a Republican governor, a Republican legislature, and he strongly encouraged them to redistrict the state in the middle of the decade. Now, this has been done before, including in Texas, but I don't think it's a good idea because changing the rules in the middle of the game is always controversial, and it can have unintended consequences, and I think it has this time. So, Merrill, I think all of this has set into motion a race to the bottom where state after state, the ones in the blue states run by Democrats, the red states by Republicans, they're trying to redistrict, gerrymander everything. The problem with that is this. The loser, forget the Democrats and Republicans, the loser are the voters because the politicians are deciding who should vote for them rather than the voters deciding who they get to vote for. And we have a problem in this country, partly because the way we move around and we're grouping together by values and what we believe in. So there are fewer and fewer districts that are competitive. So in states like Texas, the Democrats are going to be down to 7, 8, 9 seats, and they get over 40% of the statewide vote. In California, where Republicans get over 40% of the statewide vote, they're probably going to be down to 3, 4, or 5 seats out of 50.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly not only unfair, but I think it shortchanges the voters. So in California, there's an election in response to what happened in Texas. The Democrats are throwing out or putting on the ballot a proposal to throw out the Independent Redistricting Commission that Arnold Schwarzenegger helped set up and the voters approved, and based on all the anti-Trump sentiment out there, throw it out and put in a Democratic gerrymander that will take about 5 Republican seats, the same number as were taken away from the Democrats in Texas. And this is cascading all around the country. Virginia is trying to do the same thing for the Democrats. Missouri is trying to do the same thing for the Republicans. I understand the House of Representatives is important, but there's something at least as important, which is, are we going to have elections that are really meaningful, or is it going to be just a shirts versus skins, your team versus my team, and ideas and issues play very little role in who wins a congressional congressional election or how campaigns are conducted.
You know, part of the problem was that states had to redistrict and had to, in essence, based upon the Voting Rights Act, I believe, make sure that minority people were able to elect somebody from essentially from their race.
And that interpretation, racial gerrymandering, is what's before the Supreme Court.
Right.
And they may well change that and say, you know, it's been 60, 70 years since the Voting Rights Act, and it's time to shift to a new system because, you know, basically there's very little evidence that blacks or minorities are discriminated against when it comes to people deciding how they vote. It does happen, but it can happen both ways. It can be that some minorities won't vote for whites. So I think that the danger here is we are making one step forward. I want to get rid of racial gerrymandering, but we're taking another step back because we're bringing back the most crass gerrymandering where you twist the districts so that they look like there's something a modern art collector would put together rather than a district that represents the community and makes sense on the map and in terms of equal representation.
Well, it seems like to me that they're going to have to make a change because there was a time back in the 60s where blacks tended to marry blacks, Hispanics tended to marry Hispanics, whites tended to marry whites, and all that has changed now so that you have so many cases in which you have whites marrying blacks or Hispanics, and then you have children and they marry maybe somebody from a different race there. And so within a neighborhood, blacks do tend to sort of stay in one place, but to a large extent, they're moving out into the neighborhoods, and you've got this mixture. It's got to be increasingly difficult to even draw a district that you say we're going to make sure you got 60% blacks there.
Well, people pick a box on the census form, and what that means is they pick the box and they're allocated to that category. A lot of people don't think there should be boxes. A lot of people, especially the younger generation, basically don't want any of this. They simply want to be judged as individuals, to be judged as Americans. But there's no box for that. So the left wants to put us increasingly and consistently into a group identity, and I think the way to make America move forward is to try to, we can't be completely colorblind, but we can try to de-emphasize color and try to judge, in the famous words of Martin Luther King, judge people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin.
So the question is, President Trump started this because he wanted to get Republicans elected. Is it possible with other blue states sort of moving in here that it might have actually, by putting this ball in motion, he might actually end up having more Democrats because they did a better... Democrats have been pretty good at redistricting in ways to help Democrats over the years. Could he end up actually hurting Republicans?
I've looked at all the states, and I would say it's probably going to end up breaking even, that the Democrats are going to shift enough seats to probably pick up, 8 to 10. The Republicans probably the same. I guess the argument against my point of view would be the House of Representatives elections are so close now in terms of the number of seats each party gets that 1 or 2 seats can make the difference between a majority and a minority. Mm-hmm. So no one knows. I think in the end, the economy and the perception of whether or not President Trump is a success or not are going to play far bigger roles in the election than these behind-the-curtain, political games.
So a number of states initiated voting reform over the past several years. They've been accused, especially the southern states, of trying to essentially block the black vote. But where are we on states doing election reform? Are there some good ones out there? Have we got this? Are the states pretty well settled? Are there changes that need to be made?
The biggest problem we had in 2020 was as soon as COVID hit, the left was ready with a whole bunch of ideas that had been gathering dust on a shelf that they had never been able to implement, and they took them down and said, well, because of this health emergency, we have to impose, mail-in voting for everyone. We have to move to different way of counting the ballots, different way of declaring whether the ballots are valid or invalid. And they were able to push those through often with just a governor's order or the order of even just a health commissioner. And the legislatures in almost all the states never were consulted on this because of the COVID emergency. Well, now that COVID is behind us, most of that has gone back to the old ways, but with some differences. For example, in New Jersey, the Democrats have a real structural advantage because everyone in New Jersey who has ever voted now gets a ballot in the mail, which is designed in a sense to increase turnout, but it also increases the chances that people will be filling out the ballots and sending them in, and they're not from proper voters. Passaic County, New Jersey, specifically Patterson, has had 2 city councils.
John, hold it there. We will be back with our final segment with John Fund in just a minute.